Founded in 1853 by a riverboat captain and his party, King Ranch is the largest working ranch in the United States. The South Texas ranch spans over 825,000 acres, nearly 1,300 square miles. The landmass of the U.S. state of Rhode Island, which is largely split by Narragansett Bay, covers just over 1,000 square miles, meaning the King Ranch is larger than the small New England state. While most descriptions or discussions of King Ranch focus on its Texas roots, it has expanded its operations over time, including citrus groves and farming operations in Florida. It was founded as a cattle ranch, with horses as a necessary sideline, since they were needed to tend the cattle. It remains a major producer of cattle and beef. In the late 19th century, the ranch developed the Santa Gertrudis breed of cattle, the first recognized beef cattle breed developed in the United States. The ranch has since developed other breeds, including the Santa Cruz breed. The Santa Cruz was developed in response to consumers' tastes, for those seeking tender beef with good flavor and marked marbling. The ranch has been an innovator in horse breeding too, and though it no longer breeds thoroughbreds, it was the King Ranch which produced the 1946 Triple Crown winner, Kentucky Derby, Preakness Stakes, Belmont Stakes Assault. As of 2024, Assault is the only Texas bred house to win a Triple Crown race, let alone all three of them. King Ranch continues to breed top-flight quarter horses in the 21st century. King Ranch is both a major food producer and a feed producer for livestock. It has actually shrunk in size over the decades, having at one time exceeded 1 million acres in South Texas. Though the lands were reduced, the influence of the ranch grew, and it has contributed to the building and expansion of railroads, roadways, port facilities, and other infrastructure. Despite its immense size, it remains a family-owned and operated ranch, with over 700 employees working the ranch or laboring at its headquarters in Houston, Texas. Its story, like the ranch itself, is too large for one telling. How it got to be what it is today is the story to be told here. At times, it may sound like an old Hollywood Western, at others like science fiction, and at others like a modern television series. It's a big ranch with a big story. This is just a small part of it. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Larry Holsworth, so be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the most important places in history. Let's get to it. Richard King was the son of poor Irish immigrants, born in New York City in 1824. By 1833, he was apprenticed to a jeweler in the city, a position he evidently detested since he ran away from it and his home by stowing away on an outbound ship. During the voyage, King was discovered by the crew, and rather than holding him in irons, which they had the right to do, the vessel's master took pity on the boy, who had not yet reached his 10th birthday. By the time the ship, Desdemona, reached its destination of Mobile, Alabama, King had been taught some of the rudiments of seamanship and navigation. It was the era of the river steamboat, with vessels of various sizes and appearances. Some appeared as little more than a barge with a shanty for a pilot house. Others plied the rivers looking as if they were a wedding cake on water, though it was a cake that belched smoke and glowing cinders into the sky as it went along its way. King was lured into life on the rivers, learning the trade and its many intricacies, which included how to operate the vessel, how to maintain the machinery, how to manage a crew, and most critical of all, how to read the river to ensure safe passage across ever-changing sandbars and deadfalls. By the time he was 16 years old, he had earned the coveted title of riverboat pilot. In 1842, he answered the call to arms during the Second Seminole War, enlisting in the Alabama militia for service in Florida. There he met Mifflin Kennedy, a Quaker from Pennsylvania who worked as a clerk and pilot in steamboats along the Chattahoochee and Apalachicola rivers. Kennedy and King became lifelong friends and eventually business partners. Following his military service, King remained in Florida, working with Kennedy on the rivers. In 1847, the pair went to Texas, where they spent the Mexican-American War ferrying troops and supplies along the Rio Grande in support of the war effort. The pair remained in Texas following the war, and in 1850 formed the Kennedy and Company steamboat firm. In 1866, King became a full partner of the firm, which changed its name to King Kennedy and Company. King piloted boats on the Rio Grande and tributaries, developed new designs which improved their performance, and gained a reputation as a superb boatman, shrewd businessman with a clear eye for profitable ventures in several different fields. The firm King Kennedy and Company operated a near monopoly on the Texas waterways. The Texas of the 1850s was a state with large, huge, massive even, tracts of unclaimed land.
Beautiful, she's rich, she's got huge tracts of land.
Yet much of the land was beset with title difficulties, owing to their previous ownership based on Spanish land grants from before the Mexican Revolution, further confused by the results of the Texas Revolution, and then by squatters and poorly filed claims. Richard King learned in the 1850s of the title perils prevalent in land speculation in Texas. One of King's earliest land investments, a tract on Padre Island, turned out to have been made from an owner who did not possess the title to the land involved. Once bitten, twice shy, King established a long-term relationship with a law firm which specialized in title research and the vagaries in Mexican and even Spanish real estate law. King's subsequent land investments provided better returns. He began buying tracts in South Texas, which sound huge to modern ears, but were relatively small to the Texas investors of the time. 15,500 acres, followed by 53,000 acres, and several additional tracts were gradually acquired, so that by 1885, the year of his death, King had purchased over 614,000 acres of Texas land, nearly all of it undeveloped. King's purchase of those first 15,500 acres on a creek called Santa Gertrudis was for the princely sum of $300. It was this tract, purchased in 1853, which saw the beginning of what became King Ranch. King entered into a partnership with another friend, a Texas Ranger named Gideon Lewis, during this purchase. Together, Lewis and King acquired land and cattle for the creation of the ranch. They selected a brand mark for their cattle, a stylized LK brand, which remains in use in the 21st century. Lewis, the Texas Ranger, had an eye for the ladies and an evident lack of discretion. In 1855, he had an affair with a married woman whose husband confronted Lewis and killed him. Whether it was a classic Western confrontation as often depicted in the movies or a more sordid confrontation is unknown. At any rate, Lewis was dead and King needed a new partner to manage the late Ranger's extensive holdings. When Lewis's estate came up for sale, King arranged for another investor, one he knew from his riverboat contracts, to bid on the property. King retained operational control of the steadily growing ranch, though through various business arrangements he allowed title to the land upon which the ranch operated to be assigned to silent partners. In 1860, King left his residence on the Rio Grande to concentrate his time on the expanding ranch and its business. He made his home at Santa Gertrudis. He retained his interest in the steamboat concern. He created a new livestock company, R. King & Company, to manage the ranch and its operations, with Kennedy as a partner. 1860 was a time of turmoil in the South, as talk of secession dominated Southern state houses and public gatherings. In 1861, the talk of secession became reality. King and his partners registered their shipping interests in Matamoros, Mexico, as a Mexican company. Their subsequent shipping of cotton to Mexico and food, medicines, and other supplies to Texas during the ensuing American Civil War was protected under Mexican law, but their facilities in Texas were not. Nearly all of King's business operations and real estate were located in the region of Texas between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River, an area known as the Nueces Strip. In 1863, Union forces raided the Nueces Strip, capturing the town of Brownsville, and in December 1863, looting the King Ranch, burning most of its buildings. King managed to elude the Union forces, though. In 1864, Texas troops reoccupied the Nueces Strip. King, however, remained in Mexico, where he had fled for safety during the Union raids. He remained there until U.S. President Andrew Johnson issued a blanket pardon to Confederates as part of Reconstruction in 1865. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, South Texas, indeed most of the South, was destitute. Infrastructure was wrecked, the former Confederate currency worthless. King and his partners had made a fortune during the war, and with considerable foresight, had kept it not in Confederate-issued paper, but in Mexican gold. In the post-war years, demand for beef rose dramatically in the North, and the railroads extended into Kansas and Abilene. Beef could be driven on the hoof to Abilene, where it was sold to brokers, who then shipped the live cattle by rail to the stockyards in Chicago, where they were processed for consumption. Kennedy, King, and their associates spent over a year rounding up stock in the Nueces Strip, including cattle, sheep, hogs, horses, and mules. They then divided their stock and in 1868 dissolved their ranching partnership, with King retaining the King Ranch, based at Santa Gertrudis, the estate which had the original 15,500-acre purchase in 1853. Kennedy moved his operations to Los Reales Ranch, about 20 miles south of Corpus Christi, Texas. King then concentrated his efforts in ranching, breeding, raising, and driving cattle for the eastern markets. By 1870, he was concentrating on the famed Texas Longhorn breed. Following annual roundups during which his cowboys formed his cattle into herds for the drive, he sold them to investors known as trail bosses. The sale was in the form of a promissory note in which the trail bosses took ownership of the cattle with a note to be redeemed after the cattle were sold for cash to a broker. Trail bosses for the King Ranch thus worked for themselves and were responsible for paying the trail hands at the end of the drive. Trail bosses also were responsible for feeding the trail hands during the drive. The hands provided their own equipment. Hands which worked the ranch and participated in daily work there were called Los Quininos, literally King's men. To them, King referred both to the name of the ranch and to Richard King as their monarch. Nearly all of the Quininos came from Mexico, recruited there by King while rounding up cattle and other livestock. Once a drive reached Abilene or one of the other expanding numbers of towns connected to the railroads to the east, the trail boss sold the herd at terms they negotiated with the broker, paid off their hands, and redeemed their note. The broker in turn shipped the cattle to the stockyards, where they sold them to meat packers. A typical drive could take up to 100 days, and upon arrival, the price to be had for the cattle often depended on how recently a competing herd or herds had arrived. King often traveled to Abilene himself to negotiate with brokers, including the number of heads to be delivered in subsequent years. In this manner, he helped prevent large fluctuations in price from year to year. King was ruthless in his business, dispatching squatters found on his land as he saw fit. Many of what later became cliches of Western movies and television were reality on his lands. He fenced his pastures and most of his ranch, hanged rustlers, and maintained an armed force on his properties to protect his interests. He also invested heavily both in the ranch as it expanded, but also in other aspects of the business of shipping meat to consumers. He sank money into railroads, meatpacking companies, ice houses, and for shipping beef by water in expanding the port facility at Corpus Christi. Throughout his career, he referred to his ranch not as King Ranch, but as Santa Gertrudis. King and his wife, whom he married in 1854 and who gave him 5 children, resided for most of their days after the Civil War at Santa Gertrudis. Toward the end of his life, King was involved with several attempts to royal discontent in northern Mexico, looking for opportunities to expand his holdings into Mexican territories after they separated themselves from their government. In 1884, King's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from severe stomach pains, nausea, and inability to eat, and general malaise. In 1885, he left Santa Gertrudis to visit his doctor in San Antonio. He never returned. He died in his room at the Menger Hotel on April 14, 1885, a long, long way from the New York City slum in which he was born. Ownership of King Ranch passed to Richard's widow, Henrietta Chamberlain King. When she passed away 40 years later in 1925, only one of their 5 children remained alive. At her death, the ranch included 1.2 million acres. Her sole remaining child, Alice Gertrudis Clayburgh, and her husband, Robert Clayburgh Jr., inherited just over 800,000 acres. The rest went to other heirs. Estate taxes of over $850,000 took several years to retire, though they were paid up by the time of the stock market crash in 1929. Nonetheless, the estate remained in debt to the tune of roughly $3 million, over $55 million in 2024 dollars. By then, the days of the trail drives and moving vast herds from ranch to market were over. Cattle were shipped from ranch to market by rail, barges, ships, and increasingly by trucks. New sources of revenue were needed to supplement that from breeding and raising cattle. In Texas, oil provided such a revenue stream. In the early 1930s, King Ranch leased oil and gas rights for the property to Humble Oil, which in turn provided loans to retire the debt on Henrietta's estate. In 1939, Humble struck oil on the ranch. Meanwhile, the ranching concerns of the operation sought an improved breed of cattle for market, bearing in mind the changing tastes of the consumer and the changing means of producing cattle for market. In the early 1900s, the Longhorn was still the dominant breed at the ranch. Crossbreeding with several other breeds, including British Herefords and Shorthorns, began in the early 20th century. Bulls from India were acquired and crossbred with Shorthorns. The crossbreeding experiments required the ranch to maintain large herds of Shorthorns and Herefords to produce new bulls exhibiting the desired characteristics. By 1923, the ranch had bred a bull which sired offspring that consistently presented the characteristics of the new breed, which King Ranch named the Santa Gertrudis. The breed achieved official recognition in 1940 from the United States Department of Agriculture. Since then, the breed has been exported to countries all around the world, on all inhabited continents. Santa Gertrudis cattle were bred primarily as beef cattle. They have since been used to create several other composite breeds, among them the American Red, also created at King Ranch. The American Red is described by King Ranch as consistently offering impressive grading at 80% or higher USDA Choice Plus and Prime. The cows live longer, eat less, and thus produce more offspring during a lifetime at lower costs. King Ranch claims to be the birthplace of Texas game conservation. This claim is based on its long and unwavering commitment to ensuring wild game continues to thrive in Texas. In the early 20th century, King Ranch created some of the first wildlife conservation areas in Texas on its lands, including shelter for quail, overflow water tanks for wildlife, and managed predator control efforts. Their efforts were not limited to wildlife indigenous to Texas or even North America. Nilgai are a thin-legged, sturdily built antelope. They are indigenous to Asia, where they are found primarily across the Indian subcontinent. They are diurnal, meaning they roam during the day and sleep at night, are somewhat timid, and subsist on herbs, grasses, and woody plants and shrubs. The males sport horns which can grow up to 12 inches in length, though they are generally less than 10 inches long. Except during breeding seasons, the Nilgai exhibit timid behavior and flee at high speed when startled or when sensing danger, often running as far as 900 yards from the spot of peril. In the late 1920s, King Ranch worked with the San Diego Zoo to obtain a brood stock of Nilgai and installed them on the ranch. Evidently, the Nilgai found themselves at home in South Texas, as King Ranch now sports a population of over 15,000. Nilgai have spread out from the confines of King Ranch, with another 30,000 or so along the Texas-Mexico border. Besides Texas, they have also been reported in other states, including Alabama, Mississippi, and some have even been reported in Florida. Numerous companies and clubs support Nilgai hunts, including on King Ranch for those so disposed. Both the wild turkey and white-tailed deer populations have thrived on King Ranch and subsequently in South Texas as a result of conservation efforts spearheaded by King Ranch in the 20th century. Hunters cannot simply avail themselves of the ranch lands. Private hunts and guided hunts may be arranged, but those wandering onto ranch lands without proper credentials are trespassing and liable to poaching charges as well. King Ranch was involved in farming even before the Civil War, growing both cotton and milo, the latter being a form of millet primarily used for cattle feed. In 1961, King Ranch expanded its farming and ranching operations to Florida, on a tract of land in South Florida's Everglades agricultural area. The Florida operations quickly became dedicated to farming, growing sawgrass, sugarcane, sweet corn, and rice. King Ranch continued to grow cotton in Texas and gins its cotton at its own cotton gins on the ranch, eventually becoming one of the largest cotton producers in the United States. King Ranch sugarcane is grown in Florida, refined by the American Sugar Refining Group, an international consortium with refineries in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Europe, and sent to market under a variety of brand names, including Domino. The refining process also yields molasses, roughly 3.5 million gallons per year. King Ranch, in what may be a surprise to many, is one of the largest citrus growers in the world through its Florida operations. Over 40,000 citrus trees are owned by the ranch at groves and locations scattered throughout South Florida. Just over 90% of the citrus trees are juice oranges, including Valencias and Florida hybrids. The remaining citrus trees produce grapefruit and other citrus fruits. The focus on juice oranges has made King Ranch the largest producer of juice oranges in the United States, an achievement likely unimagined by Richard King during his reign in South Texas. King Ranch has licensed the use of its name as well as its brand, described as a running W sparsely. Since model year 2001, the name and brand have appeared as part of a trim package on some models of Ford trucks. The automotive magazine Motor Trend described the Ford King Ranch package in 2024 as synonymous with luxury appointments. Far from appearing as a working ranch truck, as the name may imply, the King Ranch, according to Motor Trend, are usually a bit more visually extroverted and offer a slightly more earnest focus on towing and soft-roading capability. There is also a chain of John Deere equipment dealerships called King Ranch Ag and Turf. The chain began as Robstown Hardware Company in 1913. In 1981, King Ranch purchased the store, gradually expanding its number of locations throughout Texas. In 2020, its name was changed to King Ranch Ag and Turf, and in the next couple of years, it purchased other small dealership chains and placed them under the King Ranch Ag and Turf banner. As of 2024, it operated 13 locations, all in Texas, through which it sold, in addition to John Deere equipment, turf grasses grown at King Ranch. King Ranch Texas Kitchen is a restaurant in Houston, Texas, which claims it comes as close as possible to dining in Henrietta's kitchen. Among the meats to be found on its menu is King Ranch Nilgai. The restaurant describes how Richard King entertained captains of industry at his ranch, along with major politicians, foreign dignitaries, fellow ranchers, military leaders, and the like. The ranch also nods to the feeding of the caninos, as the ranch hands of mixed racial or Mexican descent were known in Richard's heyday. In April 2024, King Ranch announced it would acquire a 50% stake in Cobalt Cattle, the fourth largest operator of cattle feedlots in the United States. Cattle feedlots are the last stop for cattle before they are shipped to slaughter, where they are literally fattened up for market. The cattle are typically fed a rich diet of grain, increasing their fat content and thus the marbling of the meat. Cattle are held in feeding pens during the process, with limited room to move around. A marked contrast to Richard King's day, where cattle typically lost weight on the long drives to market. The meat they produced was thus leaner, with less marbling, and not as tender as that demanded by customers' palates. Richard King's ranch was one in which he held absolute authority, a patriarch over the land and the people who worked it for him. He was the law, judge, and jury, and when he felt it necessary, he decided what constituted justice. Yet he worked, and he drove his people to adjust to the many challenges they encountered, changing with the times, always growing, always moving onward and upward. The ranch was his legacy, yet the ranch continues to thrive. Thus, the legacy of King Ranch continues to evolve as it strives to meet changing market conditions, consumer demands, and shifting attitudes toward the consumption of beef, just as it did when Richard King invested in new methods of breeding, raising, and delivering beef to market. Today, King Ranch is part of the major agribusiness, which has supplanted small producers of foodstuffs with conglomerates. Its beef is sold under a variety of names and labels, as are its other meat products. Its produce appears as juice under several brands, its sugar under various names and packaging. Though it remains a privately owned operation, its headquarters are in Houston, Texas, over 200 miles from the ranch Richard King built. The company describes its legacy on its website. King Ranch continues to foster a culture of uncompromising quality, stewardship, and authenticity. It is not the King Ranch of Richard King's day, but it continues to evolve into a King Ranch which will serve its customers as the demands of those customers change in the future. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historically significant place we haven't covered yet, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history's most famous places. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.